As I've been saying, welcome to Promethean Action's Saturday night class for June 22nd, 2024. This is Tony Pappert. Tonight's presenter is Robert Ingram, celebrated author and American historian. And the subject is American culture and its enemies, what our forefathers did to establish American culture, what our enemies did to take it down, what we're doing today. So with no further ado, let me bring on Bob Ingram.
Hi, everyone. Yes, as Tony said, this is sort of a continuation of the presentation that I gave at the founding conference of Promethean Action, which took place about 2 weeks ago in Michigan. For those who have not seen either my presentation or the other presentations and discussions that took place there, they are all available on the Promethean Action website. And I would, there's a wide variety of very important matters that were discussed. So I would urge everyone, if you have not had a chance yet to look at those presentations, please do so. So I am going to be talking about American culture. This is a two-part class. And next week, what I'm going to focus on is the 20th century cultural attack on America. The ongoing attack over many decades, which has brought about the degeneracy we see all around us today. Which is not to say that the cultural attack on America began in the 20th century, because that would not be true. But you got to try to corral these things a little bit. The reality is that the efforts to undermine the principles of the American Republic began very early on. Really, if you wanted to pick the inflection point, it would be with the launching of the French Revolution in 1789, and then an enormous battle, political, economic, but also cultural battle, which occurred in the 1790s, the early 19th century. And that subject itself is well worth looking into, but we're not going to do that tonight. I will say, just for those who are interested in learning a little bit more about this, I'm going to talk a fair amount about Benjamin Franklin, and I will just let people know that I recently authored a two-volume biography of Benjamin Franklin, entitled Benjamin Franklin's America, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And a lot of what I'm going to be discussing tonight is drawn from those two books. For those who wish to follow it up, there is a wealth of information in those two books, which goes far beyond what we're going to be able to get into tonight. Now, look, it's obvious to everyone, except for, the degenerate minority, which wallows in degeneracy. But it's obvious to the vast majority of Americans at this point that we have a deep moral and cultural crisis in the United States. It's everywhere. The drug usage, the transgenderism, the crime, the degeneracy. What has become of Hollywood, which, Hollywood was never any great shakes, that's for certain. But at this point, it is a moral cesspool spewing out filth and garbage. And the effect this has had on our people, the effect it's had on our nation, on our young people, you know, it's impossible not to see it. It's everywhere. Now, you know, a lot of people bemoan this, and a lot of people are, you know, are fighting to turn this around. And clearly, you know, in addition to the question of economic policy, this moral and cultural crisis that exists in our nation today clearly has a lot to do with the mobilization we're seeing among the American people uh, to put Donald Trump back in the White House, you know, in 2025. That people understand that something must be done, that we've been on the wrong road for a long time, and that something must be done to turn this around. Now, I mean, um, there are some who say, well, can't we just go back to what was normal? Can't we just take everything that's happened under you know, Barack Obama, or if you want to go back to the Clintons or whatever you want to do, you know, Obama, Biden, can't we take this cultural collapse, this moral collapse? Can't we just, you know, reverse it and go back to, say, you know, the Ozzie and Harriet years of the 1950s, family values, and, you know, all of this? And the answer is no, we can't do that. The 1950s, for whatever good or bad that they were, are long dead and gone. And there is no going back to, you know, something that, you know, we have nostalgia about, some people. We are faced with a situation today where we are tasked with creating a new culture. Look, if you look at great crises in history, great collapses, you know, whether it's the collapse of the Roman Empire, whether it's the collapse of the 14th century, including, you know, the Black Death and the collapse of society in the 14th century, or if you look at the crisis leading into the American Revolution, you know, what is required at a moment of profound crisis and collapse of the, you know, the cultural axioms of society is you are challenged, you are tasked with creating something new. I mean, that's what the Renaissance was, you know, in the 14th and 15th century. That's what the American Revolution was. You know, it was the challenge to create something entirely new, which provided the basis by which you could then overcome the crisis that you're in, the collapse that you're in. Now, it is the case that you can, you know, that in creating such a cultural revolution, such a moral revolution, you can go back to truthful principles about the nature of man, about the universe. You can go back to truthful principles, you know, which have been known, you know, beforehand, which were known in earlier times. And you can access those principles. You can access these truths about human nature and the human condition, you know, and the universe. And from those principles, you can find your way towards a path of how are we going to move into the future. But you can't replicate what was done in the past. You know, what was done in the 15th century is not going to work today. What was done at the time of the American Revolution is not going to work today. You have to create something new. But it's not arbitrary. What you're creating has to be truthful, has to be based in principles, in certain universal truths, which then lead you towards new discoveries and new advances. And this was true of the American Revolution, and it's definitely true of what we have to do today. Now, a lot of people, when they look at the Trump movement, the MAGA movement, but I would call it Trump's movement. Trump is the leader of this movement, and a lot of people in looking at this, are recognize the hope that this represents, the potential for change that this movement represents. And, it is the case that within this movement, you see a number of things. One is you see a revival of patriotism, unlike anything we have seen in a long, long time. You also see a revival of what you could call religious principles. And I'm not really talking about a revival of organized religion, but in many aspects of this fight that we're seeing right now, there are deeply felt and deeply held moral beliefs, many of which are religious beliefs, which are motivating people to step forward right now, to step forward and fight right now to save our country. Now, this is all a good thing. And there's a lot of, positive things you could say about this upsurge in political morality that we're seeing among people all over the country. And that's really the best way to characterize it. Political morality, fighting politically, to morally and culturally rescue our republic. But what I want to pose to you tonight is a particular kind of challenge. And this does get back to the question of the founding principles of the American Republic, of what our nation really is. Because, and some people might disagree with this, and it's not meant as a criticism of the people who are today standing up and courageously fighting for the future of our nation. But what I want to pose to people is that we have to think a little bit more seriously about what the actual mission, what the actual nature of our republic is. That it's not enough to simply be patriotic, or it's not enough to simply stand up and say transgenderism is evil. That's all good. That's all fine, and it plays a valuable role. But we need to, we need to actually think a little bit more seriously about some of these things. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to read to you some quotations from an individual named Reverend John Robinson. Now, most of you have probably, or a lot of you have probably never heard of him, but he was a Congregationalist minister, and he was the leader of what became the Pilgrim Church, which existed first in England, then in the Netherlands, and then ultimately established itself in the Plymouth colony in 1620. And he was the leader of that church, the pastor of the Plymouth Church, or the Pilgrim Church. He never did make it to America for a variety of reasons, but for many, many years he was the spiritual leader of the Pilgrim Church. And he wrote a sermon entitled "Of Faith, hope and love, reason and sense. I'm going to read to you a couple of short excerpts from that sermon. And Robinson says, quote, "Reason is that wherein man goes before all other earthly creatures and comes after God only. For whereas God and nature hath furnished other creatures, some with hoofs, others with other instruments and weapons, both defensive and offensive, man is left naked and destitute of all these, but he may comfort himself in that one endowment of reason and providence, whereby he is able to govern them all. Thus, to love God is to become godly, and to have the mind, after a sort, deified, being made partakers of the divine nature." Now, I want to contrast that or compare that to the very well-known, section from the book of Genesis, which Lyndon LaRouche was very fond of quoting, from Genesis chapter 1, in which the book of Genesis says, quote, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." All right, so that's from Genesis. And just again, to repeat from Robinson, where he says, man may comfort himself in that one endowment of reason and providence, whereby he is able to govern them all. And to love God is to become godly, and to have the mind, after a sort, deified, being made partakers of the divine nature. So as Robinson says, being made partakers of the divine nature. And as the book of Genesis says, man made in God's image, in God's likeness. Now, this question of, we discussed this over and over again. And I think some people maybe get tired of hearing it or say, oh, I've got that, I understand that, let's move on. But in my view, it is the central issue. It's the most profound issue. Because what is being stated here is that human beings are not animals. We are not beasts. We are not governed simply by sensual appetites, but we are made in the image of God, God the Creator, that we are endowed with reason. We are endowed with rationality. We are endowed with the capacity to be creative. And in that sense, we are, by acting, by exercising our creative potential, that which makes us human, we are, as Robinson says, in a sense, not fully, but in a sense, we are deified because we are, in fact, acting in the image of God through the use of our creative potentials, our creative reason. We are distinguished in the most profound way possible from all other animal creatures of every kind. And the thing, in my mind, the most critical thing to understand about the American Revolution is, sure, human creativity did not begin with the American Revolution. That's for certain. Individuals who had this who operated on the standpoint of what is laid out in the book of Genesis, or what John Robinson is laying out in his sermon. Individuals who understood this quality of the human identity, who operated on this quality, who made discoveries, who made breakthroughs, Obviously, this predates the American Revolution. But the thing about the American Revolution is that prior to the American Revolution, individuals who were creative, individuals who made discoveries, individuals who had this self-conception were individuals. They were individuals operating within the larger context of oligarchical society, where society was not governed by these principles. Individuals may have had them, but society was not governed by them. And what you get with the American Revolution was the creation of a republic in which this concept of a creative human identity becomes the axiomatic, philosophical, and moral basis for the new republic, where you are creating a society where, for the first time, the actual nature of what it means to be human is recognized as the basis for the republic that you're creating. Now, you may think I'm reading into that, but I assure you I'm not, because it is very clear that this is what was unleashed as the societal dynamic by the American Revolution. I mean, look, again, religion is an important part of this, but people really, what I'm appealing to is for people to think this through, because you could say, you get people say, well, what we need are Christian values. Okay, well, a lot of different churches and a lot of different ministers have big disagreements on what Christian values are. You also have this thing today where a lot of people are saying, yes, the culture is evil. What's coming out of the universities is evil. All of this is evil. And what we're fighting is, atheistic communism. Atheistic communism is the enemy. Now, that's a big mistake if you think that. Because what we're dealing with here, the evil long before communism, the evil which was fought in the American Revolution, flowed from what Lyndon LaRouche called the oligarchical principle, oligarchical culture. And you can go back to this, you can go back to Adam Smith, where he says that human nature, that is, that which makes us human, are our bestial appetites, on what he called, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Or you get an individual like Bernard de Mandeville, who wrote The Fable of the Bees, where he says all human activity is governed by human appetites, by what he calls private vices, that this is what motivates people, right? That people are governed by appetites, by, pleasure, by, vices, and the, and in my view, there are too many people today who believe this. And what we have got to do is to get people to recognize that all of this is a product of oligarchical culture. Because the oligarchy believes that all human beings are governed by lust and pleasure and vices because they're governed by lust and pleasure and vices. Oligarchical culture is bestial culture. And their view is that they are simply the alphas, that it is a human zoo of animals, all striving for pleasure and avoiding pain. And they're simply the top dogs who are going to rule over this human zoo, this animal farm. That is not what John Robinson believed in. That is not what John Winthrop believed in. That is not what Cotton Mather believed in. It is not what Benjamin Franklin believed in. It is not what George Washington believed in. Their view was that we were going to free ourselves from oligarchical culture, free ourselves from this bestial concept of what it means to be human, and that we were going to create a republic in which actual human potential to do good, potential to be creative, potential to discover the secrets of the universe, potential to build a better future, that these potentials could be unleashed and encouraged and promoted by the government of the republic committed to the general welfare. This is real American culture. Now, the so look, let me just move on a little bit to Benjamin Franklin, because there's a couple of points that I want to get at. In 1727, Benjamin Franklin created an organization called the Junto. Some people have heard of this. This was initially a group of 12 people who he recruited, into a club in Philadelphia. Franklin was very young at this point; he was in his 20s, and the purpose of this junto. I mean, they did a lot of things. They wrote, they read, but they also engaged in many what you could call civic projects. The purpose of this was to bring together these dozen people for the purpose of doing good. I mean, that was their motto, to do good. And they did many, many good things. And one of the things that's interesting is to look at sort of the composition of the members of the junto. As I said, there were 12 of them. Now, among these, and I'll just list this, among these, 3 of them were printers or involved in the printing business, including Franklin himself. 2 of them were shoemakers. 1 of them was a cabinet maker. 1 of them was a glazier. 1 of them was an inventor. 2 of them were merchants. 1 of them was a surveyor. And 1 of them was a silversmith. Right? Now, if you look at these people, they're all involved in one way or another in some form of productive work. None of them are wealthy elites. None of them are lawyers. None of them are college professors. They're all working men. And in fact, they were known as the Leather Apron Club. But they're all involved in some form of productive activity. Now, I want to skip ahead more than 50 years to an essay that Benjamin Franklin wrote in 1784. It was an essay entitled Information to Those Who Would Remove to America. And, you know, Franklin writes this right after the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War, at a time when a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in England and elsewhere in Europe, you know, aristocrats, rich people, are talking about moving to America because they say now that the war is over, if we move to America, you know, we could strike it rich there. We could make our fortunes in America. We could become even more wealthy than we actually are. And Franklin writes this essay basically making fun of these people and saying that they're in for a rude surprise if they come to America looking to strike it rich. And I'm going to read to you a couple of short paragraphs from this essay. He says, "There are in America few people so miserable as the poor of Europe. There are also very few that in Europe would be called rich. Rather, in America, it is a general happy mediocrity that prevails. There are few great proprietors of the soil and few landless tenants. Most people cultivate their own lands, or they follow some handicraft or merchandise. Very few rich enough to live idly upon their rents or income, or to pay the high prices given in Europe for paintings, statues, architecture, and other works of art that are more curious than useful. Much less is it advisable for a person to go to America who has no other quality to recommend him but his birth. In Europe, it has indeed its value, but it is a commodity that cannot be carried to a worse market than to that of America, where people do not inquire concerning a stranger, what is he, but rather, what does he do? If he has any useful art, he is welcome. And if he is a husbandman, he is honored. And even the mechanic is honored because of their employments are useful. In short, America is a land of labor, and by no means what the English called lubberland, a place of luxury and ease. And Franklin goes on to say that in America, a mere man of quality who does not want to work would be despised and disregarded, while anyone who has a useful skill would be honored. Quote, industry and constant employment are the great preservatives of morals and virtue. And he goes on to say that this will serve as the moral basis for what America must become. Now, what does Franklin mean when he talks about a happy mediocrity? Well, today, you know, some people might say he's talking about the middle class, right? You know, and in a sense, that's true. But there's a problem with that because the way people define these things today is based on how much money you make. You know, if you don't make very much money, then you're in the lower classes. And if you make, you know, a medium amount of money, then you're in the middle classes. And if you make a lot of money, then you're in the upper classes. So these classes tend to get divided based on today, you know, categorized based on income. But Franklin is talking about something different because you know, if you look at the individuals, the 12 individuals who made up the junto, or if you look at what Franklin is describing in terms of the mechanic, the husbandman, and these other types of occupations, he's not just talking about a middle class. He's talking about a productive class. This is the productive class. And what Franklin is saying is that the productive class, is what must become the basis for American culture. That it is the productive class of a productive citizenry, which is the bedrock for American culture and really for the American Republic, right? And that this is what must be fostered. This is what must be pushed forward. Now, if you look at some of the projects that Franklin was involved in, in 1732, he created the Philadelphia Library Company, first public library, which had as its motto, to pour forth benefits for the common good is divine. And in 1743, he creates the American Philosophical Society. In 1751, he creates the Pennsylvania Hospital. In 1755, he creates the College of Philadelphia. These are all projects of the Junto, right? Of Franklin's Junto. And all of the Junto members are involved in these projects. And, in setting up both the American Philosophical Society and later the the College of Philadelphia, what Franklin, is insistent upon, and he writes this, is that these institutions are going to be devoted to what he calls useful knowledge. Now, what does he mean by useful knowledge? He defines this. He says, quote, all new arts, trades, and manufactures that will increase the power of man over nature. All new arts, trades, and manufacturers that will increase the power of man over nature. And he devises areas of study, and he devises a curriculum, including botany, mining, chemistry. And he also states in the founding document of the American Philosophical Society that this society will foster and sponsor experiments that let light into the nature of things. In other words, we're not just talking about practical economics, how to have better farms, how to build better machines. Yes, all of that, but also discoveries that will increase man's power over nature and experiments that let light into the nature of things. That is, investigating the higher scientific principles and making discoveries and sponsoring and supporting the work to make discoveries which increase man's knowledge of the universe and increase man's power in the universe. And this is what Franklin is talking about, creating an American culture based on scientific and on physical, economic progress. And that being a citizen of this republic, of this new nation, which he's fighting to build, and then which later comes into existence at the Constitutional Convention, being a productive citizen meant contributing to this progress, acting on the universe to advance human society, to uncover secrets of the universe, to increase man's power over nature for the benefit of all of humanity, right? A future-oriented, productive citizenry. Now, what I argue to you today, and this is sort of for those who heard my presentation at the Promethean Action Conference, this is somewhat repetitive, but it needs to be repeated. That this question of a productive, creative citizenry, this defines American culture. Culture as Franklin fought more than 50 years to bring into existence. And that this was the promise which was then unleashed. As I said at the beginning, there were many creative people prior to the American Revolution. I mean, name them, Plato, Dante, Kepler. Yeah, I mean, you can go on and on and on. But what was, what the promise of the American Revolution was that this access to creativity, to discovery, to progress, to creating a better future. And this is where you engender optimism in the population, that this then becomes embedded in the American Republic. For the first time in history, this access to progress and creative reason and thought and discovery, this becomes made available to all of our citizenry, and this is the role of the government in promoting the general welfare to ensure that that is carried forward into the future. Now, obviously, this question of destroying the productive class has been of eradicating this has been an ongoing, priority of the oligarchy. And obviously, this has been one of the primary intentions of the economic and financial policies we have seen over the last 30 to 40 years. I mean, you go back to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. You could go back to before NAFTA, certainly. But, let's sort of take NAFTA as the inflection point and everything we've seen since then, in which our productive economy has been dismantled. I mean, we have good things going on in the United States today. You have SpaceX, you have other things like that. You have people involved in frontier work. We have certain things going on in nuclear energy and fusion energy and other important fields. But it's a relatively small percentage of our population involved in this work. If you take all 300 or so million, however many there are right now, I lost track. What has been wiped out is the broad productive workforce. The tens of thousands of factories, the tens of millions of American workers involved in producing all kinds of things, some minor, some very important, wiped out. And as that productive economy and productive workforce has been wiped out, we have witnessed, the collapse in living standards and what have you. And otherwise, we have been reduced to an economy of people scrambling with various schemes of how to make money. How can I make money? Where do I get the money to pay my mortgage? Where do I get the money to send my kid to school? Where do I get the money to, for my health care? And what has been lost is this sense of people actually having a productive identity, of actually being involved day in and day out. I mean, LaRouche used to talk about the grandfather with his grandson, and, with the little grandson sitting on the grandfather's knee, and the grandfather would point to a bridge and say, grandson, I built that bridge. And he would point to it with pride. Now, you can make fun of something like that, but that was, that image is more true than people might realize of how many people were involved in building how many things all across America, for decades, for more than 100 years, building the Tennessee Valley Authority, building the Hoover Dam, building this, building that, both in government projects and in the private sector, building the nation. And, this has been wiped out. And I tell you, there is a great, I'm not going to go into it tonight, but just sort of as an aside, this attack on the middle class, on the producing class, if you want to use the term middle class, you can, as long as you understand what I'm talking about. This cultural attack on them also was a major preoccupation of the oligarchy during the 20th century. And I'm not going to go into it in depth, but if you go back to and we'll get into some of this next week. If you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, a major preoccupation of the literature and the movies and other things that were being pumped out in the 1920s and 30s was to ridicule and denigrate the American middle class, to portray them as stupid, money grubbing, corrupt, venal, really, a class of people who were uncultured, who were to be laughed at. And I mean, this was a preoccupation with a lot of American writers. Sinclair Lewis was one of them. I mean, if you read Sinclair Lewis's books, Main Street, Babbitt, the rest of them, nothing but a vicious attack on the American middle class. Same thing with Sherwood Anderson. Same thing with many others. This is what this New York intellectual H.L. Mencken coined a term called the bourgeoisie, which is what do they call it? A patronym? I forget the term. Combination of two words, boob, and bourgeoisie. That's what he called the American middle class, the bourgeoisie. Bunch of boobs, bunch of rubes, bunch of uncultured, morons who only cared about, money grubbing, and who were a bunch of hypocrites in their social relations, And you go through 20th century art and literature, and the middle class is treated with, disdain is not the right word, contempt, with contempt, and a lot of this rubbed off on the baby boomers in the 1960s. I mean, the baby boomers who went away to college and started reading radical literature. What do they think? Their parents were uncultured. Their parents were stupid. Their parents didn't understand all these highfalutin intellectual ideas. And of course, one thing that most of the baby boomers, certainly the college educated baby boomers, coming out of the 60s and 70s, one thing they could all agree upon was that they never, ever, ever wanted to have a blue collar job. They wanted to have a white collar job because blue collar work was beneath them and uncultured. And so this has been an ongoing, both economic destruction of our productive class, but also the effort to ridicule and extirpate, a productive identity if you go back to what I've been, laid out with Franklin and what Franklin was doing, a productive citizen is the basis for American culture, the basis for it. Now, I want to just, I'm skipping over a lot of things, but that's okay. I always do that. Um, the um, the and I mean, again, just to take just two things. Two things, and then I'll end. One is on this question of economics, because you can ask yourself, how does Franklin's notion, how does Franklin's ideas, how does this fit in with Hamiltonian economics? Well, it fits in pretty clearly. But I'll just give you a couple of short quotes from Alexander Hamilton's report on the National Bank. Hamilton said in the report on the National Bank that the purpose of the bank, quote, is to succor the industrious, to discredit the rash and unthrifty, to discountenance both usurious lenders and usurious borrowers, right? To aid the industrious and to discourage the rash, the unthrifty, and the usurious lenders and borrowers. And he goes on to say, Hamilton, quote, the tendency of the National Bank, excuse me, the tendency of the National Bank is to increase public and private credit. Industry is increased, commodities are multiplied, agriculture and manufacture flourish, and herein consists the true wealth and prosperity of the state. So, to me, that could not be more coherent with what Franklin is talking about. I mean, look, the purpose of a return to the American system of economics right now is not simply to create more jobs so that people have a higher standard of living. I mean, we all would like a higher standard of living, we all would like to have an economy in which people are able to, raise their children and families and, lead a decent life. But what is being talked about is, what you're creating is an open-ended, productive future. An open-ended, productive future. And this has a lot to do with family formation and the question of having children, because it's not just a question of, do you have enough money to have children? It's, do you have faith in the future? Do you have faith in a government that is committed to what Franklin is laying out, what Hamilton is laying out, to a government, a republic, which takes that trust as a sacred duty to create that kind of a productive future, for your children and their children and their children? Do you actually have, faith that this is what America stands for? This is what we're going to build, and that in such a way that not only that people are eager to have children, eager because they want to bring children into the world. They want to bring children into a society that has such opportunity and hope and potential, in which their children can participate in something good. Now, I just want to close by just referencing, a few people from the 20th century, of some sense of what we've lost and what we need to get back in terms of again, what it means to be an American. So I'm just going to mention, and I'm not going to say much about them, but I'm going to mention a handful of people here. The first is the Wright brothers. Now, people know the Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, etc. But the Wright brothers were both sons of a clergyman. Neither graduated from high school. They did not have university degrees. And starting very young, they went to work. They had a lot of odd jobs, but they were fascinated by mechanics, bicycles and other things, and then aircraft. And I'm not going to go into it, and I'm not an expert on the Wright brothers, but they essentially became self-taught mechanical geniuses and eventually developed the airplane that flew at Kitty Hawk. Then you have Henry Ford, who Susan Kokinda likes to talk about. But Ford was the son of an Irish immigrant. He was born in a farmhouse. He only completed the eighth grade. Eighth grade. He never went to high school. He left home at the age of 16 to find work in Detroit, and basically worked his way up, and eventually did what he did, created the Ford Motor Company, created everything he created. And then you have the Dodge brothers, who I think they built the transmissions for Ford for about 10 years and then went out on their own. I may have that backwards. But the Dodge brothers, they were sons of a machinist. Again, they did not have an education. They began work in a boiler shop. They worked on machines for years. And they worked and they got better, and they worked and they got better, and they made discoveries, and they made little inventions, and they developed advanced transmissions, and they played an indispensable role in the creation of the Ford Motor Company. Then, of course, you have Thomas Edison, which, that's a whole nother story in and of itself. Who he came from working class parentage. He attended school for less than 1 year, 1 year of schooling. That's even less than Abraham Lincoln, And, his first jobs were as a butcher's assistant. He spent quite a bit of time selling newspapers on the streets, but he eventually worked himself up, all of these people, blue collar individuals who had the opportunity and who developed into some of the most important and critical, inventors and industrial, leaders in the history of the United States. This was American culture, and then I'm going to mention one other individual, which some people may take offense to, but I'm putting him up for a particular reason, mostly because he was he's another example of this, but I also am putting him up because he was my own father's boyhood idol. And who I'm talking about is Charles Lindbergh. Now, Lindbergh today obviously is known by many people for the role he played during the Second World War in supporting the American First Committee and, trying to keep us from entering World War II. And, he's developed a bad reputation, rightly or wrongly, for being sympathetic with the Nazis. I'm not an expert on his life, but I want to mention him here, not because of what he did in the 1930s or 1940s, but because of what he did in the 1920s. Because as some people may know, in May of 1927, Lindbergh made the first nonstop flight from New York to Paris, a distance of over 3,600 miles. A solo flight, nonstop flight, first individual to do it. The flight took 33 and a half miles, 33 and a half hours. Now, the thing about Lindbergh is he didn't just pilot the plane. He also was directly involved in the engineering and construction of the plane, including the plane's engine and many other things. I mean, there were other people involved as well. He was not the major engineer of the aircraft, but he was directly involved in it for months in putting this plane together. And then he flew it to Paris. And what I'd like you to do is put up those two pictures, Tony.
Okay.
Two pictures.
Well, that's the one. You want me to go to the second?
Leave that one up for a second. When Lindbergh came back to New York City in June of 1927, he was given a ticker tape parade in New York City. This is one photograph of it. You can see that's part of the parade. You can see all the people lining the sidewalks. And then go to the second picture. That's another view of part of the parade. Now, you may or may not be aware that the parade that Lindbergh received or took part in New York City, this is to honor his transatlantic flight, was the largest parade in the history of New York City. And given that, probably the largest parade in the history of the United States, certainly the largest parade in the history of New York City. 4 million people attended the parade. I mean, today, we make a big deal when Donald Trump speaks in Wildwood, New Jersey, and 100,000 people turn out to see Trump. And we should make a big deal out of it because, it's a tremendous outpouring of patriotic Americans. And certainly Joe Biden couldn't draw a 10th of that or a 20th of it. But that's 100,000 in Wildwood to see Trump. 4 million people turned out to see Lindbergh. Now, 1927. Now, what is this? What is this? And this is during a period when Edison is doing his stuff and Henry Ford is doing his stuff and other people, I mean, this is a tremendous outpouring. In one sense, patriotic, sure. But in another sense, what is it they're celebrating? They're celebrating this great triumph, American triumph of science, of engineering, of mechanical skill, of courage, and resonating in people's hearts. Pride in that this is what it means to be an American. This is what America can accomplish, right? This productive identity of we can cross boundaries, that have never been crossed before. Now, you can take that down, Tony. And I will just tell you, since I mentioned my father, that when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, my father told me that at that moment he had made up his mind, and he was 13 years old. My father at that point, he was 13 years old, and he had made up his mind at that moment that he was going to be a pilot, that this is what he wanted to do, that he was going to be a pilot. And the Depression came along and those, opportunities did not exist. But then when World War II came along, my father volunteered right away after Pearl Harbor, and he volunteered for the Navy Air Force because he wanted to be a Navy pilot. Now, unfortunately, he was an enlisted man, and they were only accepting officers as pilots, so he did not get to be a pilot. But that was his goal, and he did end up, on serving in the Navy Air Force as a radio man, a machine gunner, and other things. Saw a limited amount of combat, not much. But and I will tell you later, because I may be the only baby boomer here who was not really excited about the moon landing. I mean, everyone I always meet says how much they were excited about the moon landing. But I could tell you when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in 1969, I was with my father at that point and a couple of my uncles. And they were a lot more excited about the moon landing than I was. I mean, they were just besides themselves with this excitement about the moon landing. I mean, for them, it was another Lindbergh, voyage, another Lindbergh trip across the Atlantic. It was another example of what America was really all about. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1969, I was, more interested in some other things, which I won't go into. But the thing is, this is, American culture. And when I say, in ending here, we can't go back. We can't go back. But in the way that, Franklin made his discoveries in electricity, in the way that Edison made his discoveries, in the way Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, in the way we went to the moon, what we've got to be thinking about is that as we move into the 21st century, as we move forward, what is going to be posed to us is the new discoveries. And I don't just mean discoveries in a laboratory, but the new discoveries, the new challenges, the new projects, challenges which we may not even be aware of today, but which may confront us 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. That this is, this is what we have to prepare for. That we have to, we have to be, that this is the basis, or this is what we need to begin to create. We need to be able to get people to see that the future holds enormous promise, enormous potentialities, enormous challenges, and we need to recruit all of the American people, but particularly young people, to those kind of challenges, to those kind of potential discoveries, to what they can contribute. And not everyone is going to go to Mars, and not everyone is going to invent fusion energy, but a productive future, a productive workforce, that is really what's required here. Now, I was going to say some other things about John Kennedy and what have you, but I know that this is a little bit difficult, this material, to wrap your head around, but I hope I've provoked some thinking on this. And why don't we, the one thing is that culture is not, people think of culture, music, art, sculpture, other things, poetry, drama, and there's no questioning the value of great culture of that kind. But what I'm asking you to do is to think about culture in the way Franklin is talking about culture. The way Franklin is talking about the creation of a productive class, a productive citizenry, that you're creating an in-depth culture grounded in optimism, which permeates throughout the citizenry, regardless of whether they've read a Shakespeare play or listened to a Beethoven symphony, which they should, which we all should. But a culture which permeates based on optimism in the future, regardless of some of these other things that people think of when they think of culture. So some people may disagree with that view, but I think I'll end right there. Okay, Tony?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob.